This session is all about stress and sleep. And for those of you who've ever come across any of my work before, you will know that I often talk about three systems which influence the timing and quality of your sleep. So over a typical 24-hour period, our alertness or sleepiness tends to follow a pattern like this. So we get more alert through the day, we have a little bit of a lull after lunch. Things pick up around about 5 p.m, which coincides with a peak in our core body temperature. And then as it gets dark, we get sleepy and the cycle begins again. So this rhythm is influenced heavily by three systems. We've got circadian rhythms, sleep pressure, and then the third system are sort of stress recovery balance. Now, I'm not going to talk about circadian rhythms and sleep pressure in this system because the most common reason that people come to me with sleep issues is stress, thoughts, worries. Now, that's not to say that the other two systems are not important, but in the interests of the next 30 minutes, I just want to focus on that kind of stress, racing mind. Where does it come from? What can we do about it? And this is just sort of typical data that I might get through when I deliver a corporate webinar. I very often send a questionnaire out in advance, and almost universally, no matter what company I talk to, what institution, stress, thoughts, or a racing mind will come out as the number one thing that gets in the way of people's sleep. So just so that we're on the same page in terms of what we mean by stress, from an evolutionary perspective, stress is phenomenally helpful. And if I asked you something that might make you stressed or our ancestors stressed, I'm sure that everybody would be able to come up with something, some kind of threat, whether it's saber-toothed tigers, lions, these days traffic jams. But the way that our brain evolved to respond was to be able to fight or flee. So there's this physiological cascade that automatically kicks in when we get stressed. And I'll talk about what makes us stressed in a moment, but it unleashes this physiological reaction, which is incredibly adaptive. So the hormones adrenaline and the slower acting cortisol lead to an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, greater tension in our muscles. We release glucose into the bloodstream, which fires us up for action. So phenomenally useful if we want to run away or fight a saber-toothed tiger to the death. And then hopefully when that stressor has passed, we flip all of these automatic processes onto the other side of our automatic or autonomic nervous system. So we've got fight or flight, or we've got rest or digest. So the opposing system kicks in when the stressor goes away, if everything's working well. Now, in the workplace, which is a place where many of us feel the occasional stressor, stress is not always bad. In fact, a little bit of stress, particularly for simple and straightforward tasks, can be phenomenally helpful. If you are a procrastinator like I am, if you've got some expenses to do or something, a little bit of time pressure can really encourage you to focus. Because one of the things that stress does is to narrow your attention towards the source of threat. So if it's a deadline, you suddenly find that you are focused on that thing. The problem kicks in when we've got more complex tasks or competing priorities, and we typically get to a certain point where actually too much stress can feel overwhelming, and actually it can become counterproductive. So I mention this because stress is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem comes when we don't know how to switch it off, how to handle it. And from a sleep perspective, what that means from a physiological perspective is that this stress hormone, cortisol, which has evolved to help us energize, particularly first thing in the morning, and our natural daily rhythm in cortisol is to have this great injection within the first half an hour of waking up, which makes us feel ready to accomplish things in our day. But the natural rhythm is for cortisol to decrease and fall away in the afternoon and evening, which allows melatonin, which is the hormone which signals sleep and helps to get us into a really deep and restorative sleep, to do its job. But melatonin is a pretty feeble hormone. And anyone who's seen some of the videos that I've posted recently on YouTube will know that melatonin is no match for cortisol. So if you are full of stress, you are kind of amped up, doesn't matter how many melatonin tablets you take, it's not going to help you very much with your sleep. We have to learn how to switch off that cortisol tap. So, in order to learn how to switch it off, we first of all have to know how it gets switched on. And it is, of course, not just saber-toothed tigers. And in fact, I spent a lot of my PhD stressing people out in the laboratory. So we kind of plugged them into blood pressure monitors and we measured the cortisol in their saliva. And we found what a lot of other authors have found, that there are a number of things that will reliably get that stress response going. So, yes, it's about threat to you or your tribe. And by that, I mean, it might be your team at work, if you're all under pressure, it might be your family, but also any situation which is novel. So, even going to a new place, there's something called the first night effect. When you go and stay in a new hotel, it might be phenomenally comfortable, but part of your brain goes, huh, I've never been here before. And it kind of amps up that stress. So you tend to find that sleep quality is a little bit lower. From a psychological perspective, also unpredictability, lack of control, and what we call social evaluative threat, or in other words, any scenario that might potentially embarrass you in front of your tribe. And the reason I mention this one is because for a lot of people, that's public speaking. For a lot of people, that's one of the most stressful things they do because they kind of have to put themselves out there. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective because if you did something that made you unpopular in your tribe, you probably weren't going to get fed, you weren't going to get protected. So it seems to be an evolutionary mechanism that is stressful if we feel like we're out on a limb, if you like. And I had a question before the webinar began about menopause. Now, at first glance, these do not look like hormonal stressors. These are all psychological stressors. But you can also put the body under stress with hormonal fluctuations or circadian disruption. So something like shift work or jet lag can also push the body into a state of stress. And we know that around perimenopause and menopause, we've got these fluctuating levels of hormones, which can be interpreted by the body as another stressor. So when we're talking about reducing cortisol levels, that's for any type of stress. But the most common kind is psychological. And one of our problems in modern life is that most of us recognize stress when it is acute. So, when I first joined the call, I was explaining to Charlie that I spent some of the afternoon on the M25 thinking, am I going to get home in time for this webinar? And I felt like I was in a slight state of acute stress. And that's easy to recognize. But there's also a state of stress, which is still a state of arousal, but which we can call sort of cognitive activation. And a lot of us these days spend a lot of time on our phones consuming new information. And there is evidence that being close to your phone, even if it's not ringing, it's not going, you're not looking at it, seems to lead to a higher state of arousal. And I think a lot of us get stuck in this yellow mind state. This was a model that was introduced by a researcher called Alyssa Epple and her book, The Stress Prescription. I think it's really helpful to look at it because if you've had a really full-on day, you might not be in acute stress, but you might still be ruminating about what happened that day. And you might need a bit of extra effort to push your brain into a state of relaxation. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a moment. So that's a little bit of the background in terms of how stress can affect sleep. But of course, it can go both ways. And there's loads of evidence now that the relationship between stress and sleep is bi-directional. So in this particular study, healthy young women kept a mood diary and they also kept a sleep diary. And what they were able to show is that on the days that they felt a bit more anxious or sad, their sleep was disrupted. No surprise there. But also, and this occurred for the positive emotions as well, when their sleep was disrupted, they spent less time asleep, they were less likely to be happy, and they were more likely to be anxious. And this review that was published earlier this year reported that the most consistent impact of low sleep on our emotions was to reduce happiness and increase anxiety. So, increase worry. And the reason for that is that the part of our brain which is responsible for detecting threat becomes more sensitive when we're short of sleep. Because from an evolutionary perspective, if our ancestors were deprived of sleep, it probably meant they were in danger. So our threat detection systems are amped up and we become more vulnerable to emotional disorders. At the same time, the part of your brain which is very logical and full of self-control actually has less glucose, less fuel going to it when you're stressed because your whole brain is oriented around responding to this threat. And this is important because it makes us more prone to doing things which are utterly unhelpful from a sleep perspective. So this is not your fault. If you find yourself when you're tired having more haphazard sleep patterns, not getting to the gym as much, perhaps relying on convenience foods, maybe consuming more caffeine or alcohol, and perhaps even retreating a little bit from social situations, this is not your fault. This is the way that a sleep deprived brain responds to a lack of sleep. So when I called this session Overcoming the Stress Sleeplessness Cycle, what I referred to was a cycle of behaviors and thought processes that we can get stuck in when we are stressed. And sometimes it starts with poor sleep, which elevates our vulnerability to stress. Sometimes it starts with a chronic stressor, and that might be work, it might be from a relationship, it might be perimenopause. But these things impact on our performance, they impact on our sleep, and they push us into a state of hyperarousal. And all that means is that if you imagine that balance between fight or flight or rest and digest, we're permanently pushed into this kind of fight or flight mode. So our brain starts to focus on what it perceives as a threat, which may well be a lack of sleep. So people start to worry overly about the fact that they're not sleeping, and they start to do things that they know are not phenomenally helpful for them, whether it's not going to the gym or just kind of retreating inside of themselves and being a bit less likely to ask for help. So we're all vulnerable to falling into this trap at various times. But the really important part about it is that these arrows, every single one of them, is bi-directional. And that means if you reduce the stress or you improve the sleep, then you can have knock on benefits for every other element around this cycle. And just to kind of demonstrate that, there was a systematic review which summarized the results of 65 trials, which found that if you improve sleep, you don't just improve sleep, you also improve mental health, whether that's depression, anxiety, rumination, stress, even psychosis symptoms. So even improving your sleep a little bit can make you more resilient to stress. So all the sleep hygiene advice that you might have heard of before around sort of strengthening circadian rhythms, reducing sleep, managing sleep pressure. So not overdoing it on the caffeine, for example, getting physically active. Those things are really going to help your sleep. But for the rest of this session, I'm going to give you 10 strategies to help manage that stress system to try and reduce that hyper arousal. So I'm going to do my very best to get through all 10 in the next kind of 13 minutes. I will have a recording of this session you can look back at your leisure. But let's go through them and see whether any of them resonate with you. So what can we do about chronic stress? Well, conceptually, I have to say, I used to fall into the trap when I used to get stressed in my old job of kind of waiting for things to pass, of going, okay, things are stressful right now, but as soon as that deadline is passed, as soon as I go on holiday, it's all going to be okay. And I think there's a temptation to just kind of push it to the back of our minds and try and wait until almost that storm has passed. But what I have realized as I've got older is that the storm never passes. There are always more stressors to deal with, that whether they're psychological or physiological. And so we all need to equip ourselves with the ability to kind of ride those waves, because we're never going to find ourselves in an environment where there is no stress. There is always going to be stress. So we've all got to learn to kind of cope with the ups and downs. So first of all, number one, radical acceptance. What do I mean by this? Well, this idea comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. And it kind of says that if there's something you're really worried about, rather than trying to push it to one side, the best thing to do is actually to kind of embrace it. Because the more we push down feelings, the more they kind of bubble up to the surface eventually. So in CBT for anxiety, there's a tool called Worry Time, where people are encouraged to sort of sit down for 10 or 15 minutes every day and write down what they're worried about, write down what's on their mind. And getting it out from the brain and onto the page can be quite therapeutic. And once you're looking at those thoughts, those things that are worrying you, very often they don't feel quite so overwhelming. You can kind of break them down and put them into actionable chunks. And we can use that same framing to think about not being able to sleep. So rather than lying there going, oh my God, I can't believe I can't sleep, this is a complete disaster, tomorrow is going to be awful, all those ruminating thoughts that automatically pop into our brain at 1, 2, and 3 o'clock in the morning, there is a technique called paradoxical intention, which flips that thought pattern on its head. And rather than trying harder to get to sleep, you actually try and stay awake. So just experiment with this. I know it sounds a bit off the wall, but as you're lying there, just tell yourself that you're safe and warm and there's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to go. And you really don't need to sleep. If your brain needed to sleep, it would sleep. But right now, you're just going to enjoy being gently awake. And you can even try and keep your eyes open and perhaps stare at a spot on the wall. And just encourage yourself to keep your eyes gently open and enjoy being awake. And what this does by flipping the effort towards wakefulness rather than sleep is it reduces that feeling of anxiety about not being able to sleep. And if you're tired, the odds are you might well drop off. So kind of two ideas here. One is to get the thoughts out into the open, write them down. I recommend you do that during the day. And the other is don't fight wakefulness, but just sort of accept it and experiment with that. Particularly useful kind of in the middle of the night. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, I'm sure that those of you on the call have probably all come across mindfulness before, this idea of focusing your attention on a certain point or thought, very often your breath, and just observing thoughts and feelings come and go. And this is actually the subject of my PhD. I used an app called Headspace and was able to demonstrate that people who are using Headspace were able to reduce perceptions of stress and also improve sleep quality. Now, the thing that I found through that research and in subsequent work with the police is that if you're very sleep deprived, it's very difficult to be mindful. So this idea of just accepting thoughts and feelings is very, very difficult. And the more sleep deprived you are, the harder it is to concentrate. So really, if you want to try this, start small. I recommend using an app. Calm is very good. Headspace is good. There are many other mindfulness apps that you might want to experiment with, but start with something like 5 minutes and then The research that I did certainly suggests that you need to do it for at least 10 minutes a day for 10 days before you start to experience the benefits. So if you've tried it for a day or two and then given up in the past, really do try and stick with it. It is worth it. You will feel the benefits eventually. And I was very interested in this study again in Alyssa Eppel's book, where she did a study where exactly the kind of study that I would love to volunteer for, where they got stressed people in and they invited them to go on a lovely holiday, kind of beachside retreat. And they were randomized into two groups, and one group just got a beach holiday. And no surprise there, they felt pretty good at the end of it. The other group got a very similar beach holiday, very nice environment, but they went to go and learn meditation and mindfulness techniques. So for about 4 hours a day, they were doing meditation. They also got a lot of benefits. But when they followed people up a year later, it was only the people who'd learnt the mindfulness techniques and meditation that actually had lasting benefits. So holidays are good for all of us, but for lasting benefits, actually learning mindfulness can be a really, really helpful tool. Okay, number 3, I'm sure most of you have come across breath work before. The idea here is that when we are stressed, when we go into that fight or flight state, our breathing becomes shallow and fast. And it's almost the idea that we're ready to fight or flee. So we kind of tend to have these shallow gasps. So anything that you can do to slow the breath down, take control, can send a message to the brain that you are in fact in control and not under stress. So box breathing is one of the most simple techniques. You can try this now. You just breathe in through the nose for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 4, and hold for a count of 4. And as you can see, if you picture in your mind a bit of a box, then that kind of can help. And now you need to do this for 5 minutes or so if it's actually going to calm you down. Just one iteration is probably not going to make that much difference. But breath work as a relaxation technique is very much a skill. And the more times you do it, particularly if you can do it multiple times through the day and not just when you're in bed, the easier you will find it to actually switch off that stress response. Okay, number 4. This one is a little bit different. So out of interest, do any of you on the call, have any of you tried cold water swimming or cold showers? And that's been a bit of a fad recently. I can see a nod there. Brilliant. Katia says yes. Oh, hang on. I'm going to mute myself because this was actually a video that I took. I'm going to try and mute it. So this was when I was in Norway, and I did this crazy cold water immersion. It was minus 13 degrees, and I kind of climbed into this ice hole, and it was thoroughly unpleasant, I have to say, but you did get this massive endorphin rush. And the idea of cold water immersion is actually that you are genuinely stressing the body. So any extreme of temperature is going to push your body into a state of discomfort. So temporarily you get stressed, you get a bit of adrenaline, you get a bit of cortisol. But because it's a very short-term exposure and it's voluntary, your brain starts to adapt to that unpleasant exposure. And the more times you do it, the more adept you become at switching off the fight or flight stress response. And it's been shown that although cold water immersion is a physical stressor, it seems to make people better at responding to psychological stressors as well. And you also get these physiological benefits supposedly around increasing brown fat and all sorts of other stuff. But from a stress perspective, it seems to be very helpful for enabling us to be more adaptable to stress. Okay, and you can report back on whether you think it actually works or not. It's a kind of similar idea to controlled exposure. So in anxiety treatment, for example, if somebody has social anxiety, so they're very worried about being in social environments, one of the treatments is controlled exposure. So you encourage that individual to give themselves a small amount of exposure to a social context. I say, okay, you're going to go to the party, you're only going to go for 5 minutes. The idea is not to white knuckle it and just kind of stand in the corner feeling awkward, but to try and embrace it for a short, manageable amount of time. And you can take that same concept into bed with you in a way. So in CBT for insomnia, exposure to what you fear is very often about actually getting out of bed when you're not sleeping, rather than, again, trying to force yourself to fall asleep. So the advice, if you're struggling with sleep, is only get into bed when you're really sort of sleepy tired. And if you really can't sleep, if you really feel like you've got so much sort of stress and anxiety that you're struggling to get to sleep, just stop trying. After about 15 or 20 minutes, get up, get out of bed, go do something else. Yes, you're going to be a bit more tired the following day, but it helps to break the negative cycle of lying in bed, trying desperately hard to sleep. And this is called stimulus control. And what we're doing is trying to break a negative association between your brain and your bed and not sleeping. So if you can't sleep, get out of bed. And you do that just for as long as it takes until you start to actually feel sleepy, and then you can get back into bed again. And if anyone's tried that or you've got questions about it, please do ask me, and I'll kind of chat you through how that might work in practice. A couple of other quick ones, which I'm sure you have heard of. Physical activity, honestly, it's like the elixir when it comes to both reducing stress and improving sleep. Things to avoid are very high intensity exercise before bed. So HIIT is brilliant in terms of efficiency, HIIT being high intensity interval training. You can get a lot of benefits from just 7 minutes of exercise a couple of times a week, but just don't do that right before bed. And in fact, there's a whole load of evidence that it doesn't really matter what kind of exercise you do from a mental health perspective and from a sleep perspective, so long as you enjoy it. So for some people, that means very physical aerobic exercise. For others, it might mean something a bit softer, yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi, very similar benefits. And part of it is about moderating the stress response. Part of it's probably about producing endorphins, which just kind of make you feel good. We're almost at time. Will I get through the final three? Okay, just very quickly, exposure to sunlight. Lots of lovely research suggesting that time outdoors is linked to better mental health. A lot of that is about moderating your circadian rhythms, which I promised not to talk about today. But we know that the more consistent your sleep-wake patterns, the better your sleep is. And in order to get your circadian rhythms all kind of synced up so that you're in time, you want lots of time outdoors. And the other benefit to being outdoors is exposure to nature. We know that there is a benefit in just being in green space or blue space. The Japanese call it shirin-yoku. And the more time you have outdoors, the lower you tend to find things like blood pressure, up to around about 120 minutes a week. So you get more and more health benefits up to about 2 hours a week. If you can spend more than that, great, but you probably won't experience any additional health benefits. So if you're not managing to get into nature very much, perhaps you live in a city, it still counts if you go and find a park, go and find a canal, anything up to 2 hours a week. Try and build that into your routine. Um, and then I'm just going to run through the final two and we can come on to questions. Social contact. Social contact is one of the best ways to reduce stress. The hormone oxytocin is like a buffer for cortisol. And that social contact doesn't actually need to be physical. Hugs are great. Stroking your dog is great. Even watching a feel-good movie where you watch humans connect with humans can also produce oxytocin and help to diffuse stress, which is the excuse that I use for watching a lot of romantic comedies. Final one that I'll mention today is about purpose, finding your purpose. The Japanese have a word called ikigai, which means kind of finding your purpose. And there's a lovely book about that. But the reason that purpose is thought to be so important is that it helps you prioritize. And rather than feeling massively overwhelmed with all the things that you have to do, if you can bring it back to which of these is the most important, for me at this time, then you can kind of do away with some of the noise. So if you're interested in sort of how to find your purpose, if you feel like you haven't got it right now, as I mentioned, there's a lovely book called Ikigai, and it's all about finding out, what the world needs, what you're really good at, doing what you love, and ideally something that you get paid for. I'm not saying that you need to at all change your job, but if there's nothing about your life right now that gives you that sense of deep satisfaction, maybe there's a new hobby, some volunteering, something that you could do that could give you that sense of self. And one of the reasons that I try and do these sessions is because honestly, it makes me happy to try and share knowledge. And so that's the reason that every month I do these webinars. And if there are any topics that you've missed this year, I've run some sessions on sleep and self-control, a little bit on mental health that we've talked a bit about today, insomnia and so on. Please do get in contact and I can share those with you. But I'm always very strict on timing and I've overrun by 3 minutes. So I'm going to stop there and just say, have you got any questions? I've very briefly talked about menopause, which was one of the issues that sort of came up. I haven't talked about the fact that these hormonal fluctuations, we may not be able to change those. Nobody really understands what causes hot flushes, quite frankly. But by using the strategies that I've talked about, hopefully you will fall back to sleep more easily. So things like HRT may well reduce hot flushes, those physiological symptoms, but actually the number one treatment for sleep problems in menopause is the number one treatment for sleep problems at any time, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is using all of these techniques to fall back to sleep faster. Thank you ever so much for joining. As I said, I'll make sure that I get a copy of the recording to you. And any further questions, please do send me an email. Thank you very, very much.